Okay, welcome. This is for Marshall. Marshall is a friend of mine who is just getting into no limit poker. We went to a casino and he had some fun, but he's looking to develop a very entry level basic strategy just to beat lower stakes poker. So, what I decided to do was make this YouTube video for him, and then I'll play a few games and try and emulate what I'm recommending that he play. So if you look at what I've got here, I'll just quickly go through the suggestions I have for him. Basically, a tight aggressive strategy. If you're the first one in, you're going to raise pretty much 100% of the time. The casino about 5 times the blind, online about 3 times the blind. The why behind this is because you want to reduce the field. You want to make people pay when you have a better hand than them. And you want to take the betting lead. So having the betting lead is important because people tend to check to you when you've raised before the flop. If one or more people are limping before the action gets to you, then you need to raise larger. I usually do one extra big blind per person that's in there, just again to attempt to narrow the field. Because people who limp in pre-flop, they don't often have discipline to fold, and they don't like to call and then fold, so you have to raise more. So why do you raise before the flop? To reduce the number of your opponents, to get money into the pot when you have a good hand, which is also likely going to be better than your opponents because you're going to be tight. The first part is tight, the second part is aggressive. And then you want to take the betting lead. So you want to be the one that people are looking at, that are checking to, seeing what you do after the flop. One or two opponents are going to pretty much always continuation bet on the flop. Continuation bet simply means, I put C bet, but that's short for continuation. Continuation bet simply means that you raised before the flop, so you're the one that has the betting lead, and you're going to bet again on the flop, no matter what the flop is. So no matter what 3 cards come out, you're going to bet again. So why do you do this? It's because it's hard to hit the flop in poker, and if you don't have a hand and I don't have a hand, the person who is more aggressive will win the pot most of the time. So you want to be aggressive. You want to be tight. You want to be aggressive. So it's totally okay to do this. Oftentimes you should, which is raise before the flop and then fold if someone does a three bet. So if you raise to 3 times the blind, someone goes to 10 times the blind, it's okay to fold. It's okay to bet on the flop and then fold if someone raises. Again, when your opponent shows a lot of strength, it's okay to fold. And then it's also okay to fold if you bet on the flop, someone calls you, and then you can check and fold if someone bets on the turn of the river. You don't have to bet on all 3 streets. The continuation betting is primarily on the flop, and then you can evaluate on the turn and on the river. If your opponent is checking and mostly calling and then suddenly starts betting and raising, mostly believe them, especially at the lower stakes. Unless your senses call BS, you want to only call with your best hands if this situation happens. It's unlikely that someone plays a passive line and then suddenly starts getting aggressive when they haven't hit their hand in some capacity, or they were slow playing their hand and then started to speed up. Wrong choice on the turn of river costs much larger amounts of money than small errors pre-flop. So this is an example of a live game, but you might end up calling $40 or $60 on the turn, or $50 to $80 on the river, versus $5 or $10 before the flop. So the errors later in the game have more significance. So just be more mindful on later streets, turn and river, than pre-flop. Wet board versus dry board. I'll give you examples of this when I'm actually doing hands. But wet board is coordinated, suited cards, high cards. Dry board is like 7, 8, 2, 3, 9, king, all different suits. And you will react differently based on the boards. Position, to make it simple, the first 3 spots and the blinds are considered bad positions in full ring. That means a full table with 9 or 10 people. And within 3 of the button, so the button, the player to the left of the button, and the person beside them would be good positions. So why is positioning important? A lot of beginning players don't understand why it's important to be in a good position, or why you want to be tighter when you're not in a good position. And that's simply because information is power in poker. And when you're in a good position, or if you're on the button, for example, being in the best position, you get to see what all of your opponents do before it's your turn on every street, which is huge. You can see if they're betting, if they're checking, if someone bets and someone raises. You get to see all this information before you have to make a decision. So the later you are, the closer you are to the button, the better your position is and the more value you can get out of each hand. Respect most three bets. It's okay to raise and fold before the flop. I said this already, I'll say it again. Most of the time when people make three bets, they are honest in low stakes. Respect raises on turn or river. They're almost always giant hands. Most of the time, if people are going to bluff in lower stakes, they do it more early, pre-flop, on the flop. They do it less later on the turn, for example. Okay, now let's talk about some hands. Just say semi-bluff is your friend. I'll talk about semi-bluffing a little bit in a minute, but let's talk about starting hands. So from any position, these are really, really good premium hands here. Aces, kings, queens, jacks, tens. Ace, king suited, all the way to ace 10 suited. So that's ace, king suited, ace, queen, ace, jack, and ace 10 suited. Ace, king offsuit, all the way to ace, jack offsuit. So that is the sort of like, no matter what position you're in, you're going to be playing these hands, you're going to be raising these hands. If you're in late position, so that would be on the button, let's say one away from the button, even two away from the button, you can add hands like any suited ace, ace 4 suited, ace 7 suited, etc., and all pocket pairs. I put ace, all suited aces, which is the same as ace x suited, so I just said the same thing twice. Hands like king, queen suited, king, jack suited, king 10 suited, queen, jack suited, and queen 10 suited. Those are all playable hands in later positions, as well as 10 jack suited. A lot of these kind of hands, these suited big hands, will do well against more opponents. Hands like ace, jack, offsuit, for example, do better against less opponents. I'll get more into that as we play. Also, hands like 10 jack suited, even king queen offsuit, king jack offsuit. So this is sort of fairly tight. It's only going to be about 20% of your starting hands, maybe a little bit less. And so you will be folding a lot more than your opponents. And that is one of your biggest advantages. So after the flop, you will have usually raised. So you will have the lead. So you will be the one who people look at after the flop to see what you do. Hopefully you were tight, so you have a good hand. So again, I said this before, I'll say it again. If one or two people see the flop with you, you're going to bet again on the flop, no matter if you hit your hand or even if you missed. This is called a continuation bet, and it's the strongest move in poker, but it's one of the stronger moves in poker to make small amounts of money again and again. If you get in a situation 3 or more opponents see the flop, it's okay just to check and fold, even if you raise before the flop, especially if the flop is wet. By wet, I mean there are a lot of suited cards, a lot of connected cards. It's very likely that one of your opponents will have connected to this hand and will not be folding. You don't want to burn the money and bet into 4 people, knowing that the chances of all of them folding are almost 0 if you don't have a hand. So it's okay to miss if you give up, just check and fold. And then obviously if you hit, you're just going to continue on betting. You can also bet if you have a draw, and this is called a semi-bluff. So a semi-bluff is your friend. A semi-bluff is betting when you don't have a hand yet, but you have a decent chance to get to the point where you have a hand. So examples of a semi-bluff would be if you have king, jack of hearts, and the flop is 10 of hearts, 9 of hearts, 4 of spades. You have a flush draw. So any heart on the turn of the river, you will have a very strong flush. You also have what's called overcards. So you have 2 cards in your hand that are higher than any cards on the board. So if the turn is a queen or a king, Or if the river is a queen or a king, you will have top pair with a good kicker. You also have a inside straight draw. So there's the 9 of hearts and the 10 of hearts. So therefore, I don't think, were they both hearts? Anyway, if a jack comes, you will have a straight, which will be the best possible straight. So even though you technically have king high, because you haven't made a flush or a straight or a pair, you have a lot of potential to hit a very big hand. And it is totally okay. And if anything, it is recommended to be aggressive with these hands, to try to build a pot, to try and take down the pot that's there. It's much better to do this than it would be to check and call and wait until you get your hand or don't get your hand. Because again, I've said this before, I'll say it again. If neither you nor your opponent has a hand, the person who bets, the person who's aggressive, will win the pot most of the time. So that is an example of a semi-bluff. The next is how much to bet. So the more coordinated the flop, the bigger the bet. Charge people to see more cards. So if you have, say, aces, you have aces, and the flop is 10, jack, 8, 2 suits. So it's basically like 10 jack of clubs with the 8 of spades, and you have 2 red aces. You want to bet large there because there will be a lot of players that connect with that board and will want to continue. So therefore, you need to make it expensive for them to continue. You don't want to give them the correct pot odds in order to call you. If you bet, say, 30% of the pot, if the pot is $10 and you bet $2 or $3, then if they have a straight draw, if they have a flush draw, calling is the absolute correct thing for them to do in that situation. So you are essentially playing into their hands. If you bet 80% of the pot, if you bet the pot's $10, you bet $8, well, then they are making a mistake by calling because their chances of hitting their hand are less than what money they will win in the pot. So the more coordinated the flop, and we'll get into this more when we're actually playing, the bigger your bet should be. And the less coordinated the flop, the smaller your bet should be. A good rule of thumb is anywhere between half the size of the pot all the way to 80% of the size of the pot, depending on, again, the coordination of the board, how many opponents see the flop, and some other factors, which, again, better examples of this will be after we start playing. Almost never slow play. Why almost never slow play? Because opponents' biggest mistake that they make at low stakes is calling too much. Calling pre-flop, then folding on the flop, or calling on the flop and then folding on the turn. Calling all the way to the river and then folding on the river. If you bet, you give them a chance to make bad calls on all 3 streets and build a massive pot. If you check, if you flop a full house or 4 of a kind or a flush, then you're missing an opportunity to build a bigger pot and take advantage of your opponents who will call too much. It's the exact same reason that you don't want to slow play too much, and you also don't want to completely bluff too often. Again, unless you're continuation betting, unless you're against only 1 or 2 opponents. A little bit of talk on the turn. If you bet on the flop and you have absolutely nothing and you get called, you can be done and that's okay. You can check and fold on the turn and that's okay. And sometimes they'll have nothing as well, and sometimes they will take the pot from you even though you both have nothing. It's just, it gets too, I wouldn't say dangerous, it can get too spewy, it can get too loose if you are going to just bet every single time on the flop, on the turn, on the river, no matter what. It's a good idea on the turn. Your opponent called before the flop. Your opponent called on the flop. They likely have something. And if they called you and you do not improve on the turn, even if you pick up a draw on the turn, it's okay to bet again. But if you have absolutely nothing, checking and folding is okay on the turn. On the river, mostly bet your best hands, like 2 pair or better, top pair really strong kicker, versus 1 opponent if the board is not too dangerous. It's okay to bet. The chances of getting raised bluffed on the river are like incredibly low. So it lean towards betting on the river if you think your hand is quite strong, but be prepared to fold if they raise, even if you have a strong hand. Like if the flush comes in on the river, you bet your opponent raises you, you can fold most of the time. And again, it can be independent. This is where some skill might come into place, where you might start to get reads on your opponent and realize this player is super, super wild and loose and crazy. Therefore, I'd never fold two pair against them, even if the flush came out, for example, because they're so wild. Or you might know that this player is very tight and doesn't play very much. So you'll respect it very much when they raise on the river, for example. So this is just a last little point of what Marshall will look like at the table. So this guy, this is imagining I'm looking over at Marshall and seeing him play, and I've been watching him play for a few hours. This guy folds most of the time. He is rarely in a pot. When he is in there, he always raises, and then he bets almost all the time on the flop. He bets a lot of turns too. He is disciplined and aggressive, and I don't want to play with him because he's always making things difficult for me, having to fold my medium strength hands and not be able to see a lot of flops for cheap. So you want to be a thorn in the side of your opponents. You want to be the guy or the gal who is making it a pain for them to play because they want to play loose, they want to see a lot of flops, they want to have fun, they want to be, just loose and passive, and you're the one that's in there betting and raising and making it annoying for them, basically. Last little points are signs of players. Good. I'll put good versus bad players. This is just general signs if you're either at a casino or at a online game. Good players will always buy in for the maximum. They want to have as much money at the table because they feel like they're one of the better players. Good players will reload. They'll put more money on the table if they lose some money. Again, for that same reason. Good players will rarely or never show their cards because they don't want to give free information unless there's a reason for it. They will rarely talk about their hands and what they had after the hand, and they will stay level-headed in most situations. Conversely, the signs of some bad players at the table, they buy in for a random amount of money. Like if the maximum buy-in is 300 and they're buying in for 100, likely not a good player. They'll keep playing while they're really short. They lose half their stack. They won't add more chips. They'll keep on playing until they run out of money. They will often give advice to you, and often it's bad advice, but if they start suggesting, oh, maybe you should have called there or folded there, or oh, you would have had two pair there, you should have called, it's likely they're a bad player. They will often talk about what they would have had if they hadn't have folded. They'll say, oh, I would have had a straight by the river there with my 4-8 if I hadn't have folded, which is, again, neither here nor there because you don't know what the rest of the cards are. You can only play the best hands based on the information at the time. And then lots of conversations about, oh, I'm so unlucky. Oh, I'm running really bad. Oh, woe is me kind of things. Not realizing that, there's a lot of variance in poker. So what happens over the course of an hour or two may be not reflective of what happens over 100 or 200 hours. Okay, that's it for now. I'm going to start playing some poker. Let me just pause this thing for a minute so I can figure it out. Hello.